In this episode, we're going to talk about evidence in a practical way, not as paperwork, but as the proof you use to show that security controls exist, are understood, and actually operate in real life. In payment environments, evidence is how you demonstrate that your policies, technical controls, and operational habits are not just good intentions. Evidence collection is the process of gathering the artifacts that support your claims, such as records, logs, approvals, configurations, and procedures, and doing it in a way that preserves credibility. Sampling is the method of choosing a subset of items to review when the full population is too large, such as choosing a set of user accounts, a set of change tickets, or a set of system configurations to examine. Planning matters because evidence collection done at the last minute often becomes messy, inconsistent, and stressful, which can lead to missing items and weak explanations. Credible sampling matters because if your samples are biased, incomplete, or chosen carelessly, your conclusions will not be trusted. By the end, you should understand what evidence is, why it matters, how evidence stays credible, and how thoughtful sampling helps you test controls without drowning in data. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong foundation is understanding what counts as evidence and what does not, because beginners sometimes confuse evidence with opinions or informal statements. Evidence is something you can show, not just something you can say, and it should be tied to a specific requirement or control objective. For example, if you claim access reviews happen regularly, evidence might include review records, approval timestamps, and lists of accounts reviewed, not just a manager saying they do it. If you claim systems are patched, evidence might include patch status reports, maintenance records, and change approvals, not just a statement that patching is important. Evidence can be technical, like configuration settings and log entries, but it can also be procedural, like written policies, training records, and documented incident response actions. The key is that evidence should be traceable to real activity and should be difficult to fake casually. Beginners sometimes assume that screenshots are automatically good evidence, but screenshots can be helpful only if they are clear, complete, and tied to context, because a screenshot without context can be misleading or easy to misinterpret. A credible evidence program focuses on artifacts that can be explained, verified, and reproduced when needed. Evidence credibility depends heavily on how it is collected and documented, because the same artifact can look strong or weak depending on how it is handled. If evidence is collected without noting the date, source, and purpose, it becomes hard to prove it relates to the control you are trying to demonstrate. If evidence is collected by copying files around without tracking versions, you can end up with conflicting artifacts that create confusion rather than clarity. A simple but powerful concept here is that evidence should be repeatable, meaning if someone asked you to show the same proof next month, you could collect it again in the same way and get a consistent result. Repeatability requires documented methods, clear ownership, and consistent storage practices, so evidence does not live on someone's laptop or in a private folder no one else can access. Beginners should understand that credible evidence is not only about the artifact, but also about the story of where it came from and why it proves what you claim. This story does not need to be dramatic. It needs to be clear and logical. When evidence handling is disciplined, you reduce the chance of disputes and make assessments and investigations much smoother. Planning evidence collection begins with mapping controls to evidence types, because different controls produce different kinds of proof. A policy control might be proven by the existence of an approved policy, version history, and evidence that the policy was communicated and acknowledged. A technical control might be proven by configuration records, system settings, monitoring alerts, or logs showing the control in action. An operational control might be proven by tickets, approvals, review records, and timestamps that show the control was performed consistently. Beginners sometimes assume one piece of evidence can prove everything, but most controls require multiple complementary artifacts that together show design, implementation, and operation. Design means the rule exists and is intended. Implementation means the control is configured or established, and operation means it is actually used over time. Planning helps you avoid the last-minute scramble where you realize you only have a policy document but no proof it is followed. It also helps you avoid collecting huge amounts of irrelevant material because you did not define what you were trying to prove. When you map controls to evidence deliberately, you collect less but prove more. Another important idea is defining the population for sampling, because you cannot sample something until you know what the full set of items is. The population might be all user accounts with administrative access, all changes made to production systems during a quarter, all servers in the cardholder data environment, or all incidents logged during a year. Defining the population requires accurate inventories and clear scope boundaries, because if your inventory is incomplete, your sampling will be incomplete too. Beginners sometimes treat sampling as simply picking a few examples, but sampling is only meaningful when you can explain what the examples were chosen from. If you do not know how many items exist, you cannot judge whether your sample is representative or whether you accidentally avoided the riskiest items. In payment environments, population definitions often matter because scoping boundaries can be complex, and you need to know which systems and processes are actually in scope. Defining the population also forces clarity about which data sources are authoritative, such as which system holds the official list of accounts or which tool holds the official change records. When the population is defined clearly, sampling becomes a controlled method rather than a random guess. Credible sampling requires understanding why we sample at all, because sampling is a compromise between thoroughness and practicality. In many environments, there are simply too many events, systems, and records to review everything, and trying to do so can waste time while still missing the most important risks. Sampling allows you to test whether a control is operating consistently by examining a portion of the evidence and looking for patterns. The credibility comes from the sampling method being reasonable, unbiased, and appropriate for the control being tested. Beginners sometimes assume that smaller samples are always suspicious, but the real issue is whether the sample is designed to reveal meaningful information. Some controls, like access reviews, might be tested by selecting accounts across different roles and systems to confirm the review process works broadly. Other controls, like change management, might be tested by sampling changes across time periods, system types, and risk levels. When sampling is thoughtful, it can reveal both strengths and gaps without requiring impossible effort. Sampling is not about cutting corners. It is about using a disciplined approach to learn about the whole by examining a carefully chosen part. There are different sampling approaches, and understanding them at a high level helps beginners avoid the trap of believing there is only one correct method. Random sampling is where items are selected without bias from the population, which helps avoid cherry picking and makes results more defensible. Risk-based sampling is where you intentionally include higher-risk items, such as privileged accounts or high-impact system changes, because those are more likely to reveal meaningful issues. Stratified sampling is where you divide the population into categories and sample from each category, such as sampling from different system groups or different time periods, so you do not accidentally focus on only one area. The point is not to memorize statistical terms, but to understand the logic behind why you choose what you choose. Beginners should also understand that sampling in security is often about control testing rather than precise mathematical estimation, so the sampling method should be aligned with what could go wrong. If the risk is concentrated in certain categories, a purely random sample might miss the concentrated risk, which is why combining approaches can be sensible. Credibility comes from being able to explain why your method was appropriate and how it reduces bias. Evidence also needs context to be meaningful, because an artifact without explanation can be misleading. For example, a log entry may show a successful login, but without context you may not know whether the login was expected, whether it was privileged, or whether it occurred during an unusual time. A configuration screenshot may show a setting, but without context you may not know whether it applies across all relevant systems or only to one system. This is why evidence collection planning often includes defining what metadata you will capture alongside the evidence, such as dates, system identifiers, scope notes, and who collected it. Beginners sometimes think evidence is strongest when it is just raw data, but raw data can be confusing, and confusion can undermine credibility. The strongest evidence is both accurate and explainable, meaning someone who did not collect it can still understand what it shows and why it matters. Context also helps prevent mistakes like collecting evidence from a test environment instead of production, which can happen when environments look similar. In payment environments, where scope matters, context is essential for proving that evidence relates to the right systems and the right controls. When evidence is packaged with clear context, it becomes usable proof rather than a pile of files. Another important element is ensuring evidence is protected because evidence can contain sensitive information and because evidence integrity affects trust. If evidence includes user lists, logs, or configurations, it might expose internal details that should not be widely shared. Protecting evidence means storing it securely, controlling access, and ensuring there is a clear record of who accessed or modified evidence files. It also means avoiding unnecessary duplication and uncontrolled sharing, because evidence that is emailed around or stored in uncontrolled locations can become a security issue itself. From a credibility perspective, protected evidence is less likely to be challenged as having been altered or selectively edited. Beginners should understand that evidence is valuable, and like any valuable asset, it should be handled carefully. In payment environments, evidence might include information about security controls that attackers would love to study, so protecting evidence is part of protecting the environment. This is also why evidence collection should be planned and structured, because ad hoc collection often leads to sloppy handling and accidental exposure. When evidence is protected and organized, it supports both compliance and security. A practical misconception to address is the idea that evidence collection is only for audits, because that framing causes organizations to treat it as a seasonal chore rather than an operational habit. Evidence is also how you learn whether controls are working, because if you can collect proof that a control is operating, you can measure it and improve it. Sampling can be used internally as a health check, allowing teams to identify drift, such as missed access reviews, undocumented changes, or incomplete logging. Beginners should see evidence and sampling as a feedback mechanism, similar to checking whether a car's brakes work before a long drive rather than waiting for a crash. When evidence collection is continuous and lightweight, it becomes less stressful and more accurate because it is collected closer to when events happen. It also becomes easier to investigate incidents because you already have organized records and known data sources. This operational mindset also improves readiness for external assessment, but the deeper value is internal control confidence. When evidence collection supports learning, it stops being a burden and starts being a tool. Planning also involves anticipating where evidence is likely to be weak and designing improvements before you are under pressure. For example, if logs are not retained long enough, you may not be able to provide evidence for a full period, so you might adjust retention. If change records are inconsistent, you might standardize ticket fields and approval steps so evidence becomes more reliable. If asset inventories are incomplete, sampling will be unreliable, so you might improve inventory processes. Beginners should understand that evidence gaps are often control gaps, because if you cannot prove a control is operating, it may not be operating consistently. Some gaps come from poor tooling, but many gaps come from unclear responsibilities and weak processes. Planning provides the chance to fix the underlying issues rather than scrambling to paper over them. It also helps you define what good looks like, so teams know what records to create and maintain. When you improve evidence generation at the source, you reduce collection effort later and increase confidence overall. As we wrap up, the central lesson is that planning evidence collection and credible sampling approaches is about building trustworthy proof that your controls are real, consistent, and operating as intended. Evidence is not just documents. It is traceable artifacts that support specific control claims, and credibility depends on repeatable collection, clear context, and secure handling. Sampling is necessary because populations are large, and credibility comes from defining the population clearly and choosing samples in a way that is reasonable, unbiased, and aligned with risk. Mapping controls to the right evidence types prevents both undercollection and overcollection, and it helps you demonstrate design, implementation, and ongoing operation rather than just good intentions. Context and protection make evidence usable and defensible, and they prevent evidence itself from becoming a security problem. Treating evidence collection as an operational habit rather than a seasonal audit task turns it into a feedback mechanism that improves control quality over time. For a new learner, the mindset shift is that rigorous evidence and thoughtful sampling are not about checking boxes. They are about building confidence that your security program is real, measurable, and trustworthy when it matters most.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.